In this video tutorial, we're going to go over several different important aspects in dealing with your file structure. We'll talk about the session file management within Pro Tools. We'll talk about the different supported file types within Pro Tools, and we'll also talk about whole files versus non-whole files. Alright, let's get started. Let's go ahead and create a brand new session. Command N as in new gives us a new session dialog. Here you can pick your audio file type, your sample rate, your bit depth, and your input and output settings. I want to make sure I'm using stereo mixed. You might actually work in a 5.1 environment, but this month we're actually going to be working in stereo. For supported file types in Pro Tools in versions 9 and 10, you're going to be dealing with broadcast wave and AIF. In versions earlier, such as 6, 7, and 8, you could actually use another file type called SD2, which is no longer supported in Pro Tools. You want to get used to using broadcast wave, as this is going to be the industry standard as it's compatible with both a Mac and a PC. I'll go ahead and stick with 24-bit, 44.1, and we'll create our session. It's now asking me where I want to save this session. For demonstration purposes only, I'm going to save it back to my desktop, which in general is not a good practice. You want to have a nice folder hierarchy where you save all your Pro Tools sessions. But again, for demonstration purposes, which you'll see, we'll save back to the actual desktop. Let's just name it test session for the moment. And again, saving back to the desktop is not a good idea, but to prove a couple things, I'd like to show you the difference between a session file versus a session folder. Let's hide Pro Tools and take a look. We're now looking at the session folder that was created on my desktop. Inside of my session folder, we've got multiple folders here. The first one that we're taking a look at on top is our Pro Tools session file. This is where all the pointers that are going to point back to bits of information. Whenever you trim a piece of audio, you're not really trimming it, you're changing the pointers. All that information is stored there, as well as I/O settings, input and output settings, the tracks, the way you created them, any plugins that you use, automation data, and even MIDI information is all wrapped up in the session file. Our wave cache file is simply a wave overview of how the actual audio data should be represented inside of Pro Tools, and just really helps Pro Tools to launch faster so it doesn't have to re-render the actual waveform in its opening process. It points back to this file. Your audio files is where everything's going to get stored that's obviously audio. And then you'll see other folders in the event that you'll use them. For the most part this month, we're only going to be using the three files that you see on top. Your session file, which is different from the session folder, session file, session folder, your audio files, and you may use other folders, but in the event these don't get used, these will go away. Back into our Pro Tools session itself, I want to actually talk about the different file types. Now I can actually go back and import anything I want to into Pro Tools. MP3s, 24-bit files, 16-bit files. You can pretty much import anything underneath the sun. But once it's inside of Pro Tools, it'll actually be whatever the session is. Here we're looking at the information concerning the session. Notice this is in no other location, and it's not real obvious what your session is set up as whenever you open a session that was given to you. Command 2 on the numeric keypad will actually show you your session setup information. It shows us what we chose earlier, all the different parameters, broadcast wave, 24, 44, 1. And this lets us see that whenever we import a file, even if I were to go grab an MP3 and import it into Pro Tools will actually have to convert that file and change it into whatever the current session setup is. In this case, it'd be a broadcast wave file, 24, 44, 1. Let's give you a quick demonstration about whole files versus non-whole files. Shift-Command-N allowed me to create a new audio track. We'll talk more about audio tracks in our session navigation video. In this track, I'm going to do something called consolidation. This consolidation will simply allow me to basically paste a piece of audio that didn't exist there just out of dead air. Shift-Option-3 allowed me to go ahead and consolidate, and now I have what's considered or called a whole file. This whole file, by definition, means usually in the audio world, it's a recording. You start recording, you end recording. You can't actually trim outward or play back anything what didn't exist, and in this case, it's the same as well. We have a whole file, which is denoted over in your clips bin. If you're in versions 10 of Pro Tools, it would still be called regions bin within version 9, as well as 8 and subsequent older versions of Pro Tools. But here we're looking at what is called a whole file. I know it's a whole file because its name is bold. The moment I trimmed down by even one sample, Pro Tools didn't really get rid of this information that I trimmed. It simply moved a set of pointers to the beginning and end location and then gave me an audio region, no longer a whole file. So whole files by definition cannot be trimmed outward any longer than their original length, and again it's usually done by a recording process. Versus a non-whole file is any whole file that either the beginning or end value has been changed by even one sample. You're now dealing with an audio region. It's basically a set of pointers pointing back to the beginning and end of our audio. So what do we go over here? We talked a little bit about session file management because all these files are actually files that are stored back to that original Pro Tools session folder. Let's go back and take a look at that now. So inside of the session that we named test session, we have that one audio file. We could have multiple audio regions, which just simply mean portions that were edited out or trimmed, and now you can see we've got a bunch of small regions which are just portions or pointers that point back to the whole file. But if you look back inside of the Pro Tools session itself, the session folder, alright, you're noticing that we just have that one audio file. Alright, so all the session information is still there, and we don't have any real regions within the audio because that's a whole file. It's just pointers that are stored within the session file that denote the actual beginning and end of all those small regions. So there you have it. It gives you a little bit more information about how your files are stored and saved and how to work with files inside of Pro Tools. Again, we went over session file management, supported file types within Pro Tools, and whole files versus non-whole files.